Okay, so here we have the being able to navigate between multiple components. Let's take a look at the logging component first. Right? This is going to give us a chance to play around with forms. We haven't looked at forms. Right? How do you deal with forms? Right? All right, so let's declare a simple form in the login component. Let's see, where's the login component? Let's open it up in the HTML, and let's make a really simple form. So this will be maybe input class. This might be a form control, and I'm going to do a break. I don't need a break, so let's do an input class form control. So there's two of them, right? And maybe a button here. And this will be button primary, and button block. And this will say login. Right? And maybe here we'll add an H1 just to remind us that we are in the login. So this is H1 login. Maybe H2 because whiteboard is H1. Okay? Let's take a look at that. Notice that we have our login form. Right? Registering will be probably very similar. All right, so let's see. What should happen here? So what I'd like to be able to do is, for instance, if we click on the button, we need to notify our component, right, that the user wants to log in. So we know how to do that, right? Remember, there's a click, and then a function that we're going to call. So login, and let's see if that works. If we go to our component, that's easy, right? In our component, we can just declare here the event handler login. Oh, sorry. And maybe we can do an, oh, it doesn't like that? Oh, I guess, why doesn't it like that? We do an alert. Okay, let's try it out. So if we click on login, we have the alert. Okay, so we are in there. So what do we want to do? We want to grab the username and password, right? And then perhaps go to a server and see if this person actually exists. Okay. All right. So for instance, we would need to have access to these URLs, to these form elements. Right? So to do that, we need to declare variables that can be bound to those input fields. Right? Remember that anything that we can declare in the component here is available in the HTML. So let's declare here variables. Well, this will be username. It's a string. And we have password is also a string. Password is also a string. Okay. And when we need to bind these to those elements. Right. Now this is very unlike React. Right. React uses a low-level on-click. Right, JavaScript it's as close as you want to be to actual JavaScript, and actually have access to the low-level node, right, to get the value of the node. Angular abstracts that. It creates an entire abstraction on top of that, right? You don't use these low-level on-clicks, right? You don't use the low-level HTML DOM elements ever, right? Instead you create these abstractions, right? So to bind to that variable, we use what is called the ng model. Ng model, right, is another one of those Angular abstractions or attributes that binds, in this case, binds this input field, right, to that variable, and you give it the name of the variable. So this would be maybe the password variable, right, and this is the ng model for the username. Okay. Now this won't work out of the box. By default, Angular does not load the form module, so it doesn't know how to work with forms. So we need to load that module explicitly. So let's do that. Let's go to the our configuration module here, and we can load the form module. Right? Let's load the form module. So let's do that. So this is going to be import, and we're going to import. I think it's just form. There we go. Forms module. Okay, we loaded it, and we are going to declare it here in the imports. Okay, now it has the forms. Now it knows what the ng model means. Right? If we would have tried to use it, it would have balked and says, I don't know what this ng model is. It's actually implemented inside of the forms module, which is not loaded by default. Okay? All right. Now, this variable username can be bound in two different ways. Right? It can be bound that the input field can send the value across to the component, or vice versa. The component can send the value back to the input field. Right? We call this, when it's bound both ways, we call it two-way binding. A two-way binding, which is a very common technique in Angular. Right? And to do that, we need to use these funny characters and explicitly say which way do you want to bind. Do you want to bind, if you use the parentheses, that means that you're binding one way. You're saying that the data flows only from the HTML to the component. Okay, so the component can't tell us what the username is. Only the HTML can tell the component what the username is, one way. Okay? But usually we go both ways. We say, well, not only do I want the data to flow from this HTML to the component, we also want the data to flow back. Right? So the square brackets say the component can also set the value of this variable, and I can render it here. So if the component changes the value of the username, I would see it here. Or if I type, it's sending it to the component to the JavaScript. Okay? So it's very common to bind it in both ways. But if you do have things that are read-only, right, that only the component sets the value and it's a read-only field, then you would use only the square brackets, right? So that only the component is setting the value and you can't type. Right? So again, these are all abstractions that are added by the Angular folks. All right, excellent. So now we're bound to the username. Notice that if I even click on it, if I even click on this variable, it knows that it's bound to that variable over there in the component. Notice if I click on it, it goes and it's tied to that particular variable in the component. All right, everybody good? Right. And one of the cool things is that it's actually bound everywhere. That variable is actually available everywhere in the component. Available in this in the HTML, the DOM, and I can actually render it down here, right? So that if I type, right, everybody gets notified. That's another feature in both React and in Angular, is that they do all this piping, right? That generates all these event handlers. So to make sure that if anywhere the data changes, right, anywhere where it's needed, is being notified that something happened, the data changed, right? It's up to you to re-update yourself and re-render yourself, right? But here there is no redux of flowing the data back and changing the state. We don't have any of that, right? Instead, we just have the component. The component is its own state, right? And as the state of the component changes, the DOM gets re-rendered. Right? If any of the variables in the component changes, the DOM changes. And some folks say that this is not as effective as React and not as efficient. Right? React has a very specific thing about making sure that the DOMs is updated only when absolutely necessary. Right? It's pretty fast. It's well known to be very, very fast at being able to update the DOM, right? Unlike Angular, it's considered to be much slower than React. Right? It's not as efficient. Nevertheless, I think it's an easier abstraction. Anyway, we have the username and password. We have the username and password. So we could perhaps, when we log in, pass the username and password along to the function. We can pass it along as an argument. It's a function, right? And the variable is available everywhere. I can pass it along. Over here, it's kind of unnecessary. It's kind of unnecessary because here I already have the username and password, right, as part of the component. Right? Nevertheless, it's usually best practice, right, that the data that you need, right, is passed to you, right, so that and you're not relying on, global variables, right, or side effects, right, that you only rely on whatever is being passed to you as an argument. Right? This makes it easier to test, right, that this function can be tested individually, independently of everything else. Anyway, so we have the username, and we can alert and or maybe do a console log, and perhaps render here a user object. So we can say let user, and then have maybe a username, and maybe a password, and user, and say user. What don't you like? Const. Okay, const. So that we can see in the console that indeed we are rendering, and we have the data on the login, right? So what we need to be able to do perhaps is throw this across the network, right, to our server, and our server might want to do something with it. Okay, all right. All right. So let's take a look at how we would do that next.